Hello, my name's Gary Schotten, and I'm here to be a part of Inspiring Better Business. And today we're going to talk about a subject that's called borrowing money. Now, I make a regular call to East Africa, in this case particularly the Congo, with a group, a peer mentoring group there, and they ask this question: when and how much money can we borrow? So first, when can we borrow, and then how much? Well, that's a pretty bold question when you're just getting started in business, and I realized I need to just talk about this to everyone that wants to listen and give just my opinion. Maybe you could disagree, that's fine, but there's certain rules that you need to watch for when you're borrowing money, and I've learned the hard way in many cases. First of all, you got to recognize that there's not one answer that answers this question. Certainly there's 4 different, and maybe more, but for sure 4 different phases of business ownership. Number 1, you've got an investigation stage. I mean, this is kind of when your business is a hobby. I'm talking about starting from scratch on your first business. I'm not talking about somebody that's got a lot of experience and now they're buying a bigger company. I'm talking about getting started. And so first you've got to investigate. I've used the example many times about raising chickens. Well, why wouldn't you raise a couple chickens by starting with a couple eggs and learn how to raise and hatch and grow just 2 or 3 or 4 chickens before you get to the 20 or 30 or 40 chickens? That's called the investigation stage. You can call it a business, but you're not going to make much money at that level. In fact, it's more like a hobby. You're going to spend money, and until you make a profit, you probably want to call this a hobby, because you can spend any amount of money you want on a hobby and not have to justify it. But you want to make a profit. Number 2, there's a startup phase where you're just getting started. We're going to focus mostly on that. And then number 3, it's when you're operating. Okay, now you're up and running. You've been going for a year or 2 years and you're making things happen. And last but not least is growing to the next level. Maybe you've got, like my friend Hamisi in Barara, Uganda, that has already 20,000 chickens, and last May and June of 2018 bought 10,000 more baby chickens to grow to the next level. That's great. Well, when would you borrow money? Well, in the first 2, for sure not in the investigation and not in the startup. I know that's not what you wanted to hear necessarily, but those are not good times to borrow money. And if you'll use the teachings that we talk about throughout all of our process of teachings on the website and the encouragement we have, we say start really, really small. So small, maybe some people will discredit you as if you really don't have a business, but you're just getting started. And then you're going to grow step by step, not too fast. So if you can keep from borrowing money at those early stages, you're going to be way better off. Because see, there's a big problem when you borrow money. The big problem is this: you have to pay it back, or at least you're expected to pay it back. And if you don't pay it back, you're going to ruin your name, you're going to ruin your future with the business community in your area, and you're going to get a reputation that's not what you want. So I recommend in the investigation stage and in the startup stage that you grow slow enough and steady enough that you can cash flow your entire operation without borrowed money. Now, a lot in the United States, we would mostly talk about borrowing money from a bank. Well, I know that's many times almost impossible in the developing nations, for sure, to begin with. And so I don't recommend just borrowing from your mother, your mother-in-law, your grandma, your relatives. I mean, that is very risky, because you want to have friendships beyond this business. And the reason banks don't loan money to startups, they're so risky. Very few actually take off and would be able to pay back a loan. So banks don't choose to take that risk. On a personal basis, you need to be very reserved. Well, let's get to the point of growing and then operating your business. Let's get to operating. You've been in business a couple years, maybe 2 years, 1 year, and now you're ready to do something. Well, first of all, there's some do's and don'ts about what to borrow this for, this money. I'm not saying don't borrow money. I'm just saying be very wise and be very slow to do that. First of all, just because you have some bills to pay, that is not a good time to borrow money. Now, you might have to do it very, very briefly and pay it back and learn your lesson, but don't make that a habit. Nobody's going to want to just pay you loan you money just because you have some bills. That's something you've got to deal with without borrowed money. You might have to pay it off in time. You might have to work for these people. I don't know what you're going to do, but learn that lesson. Be able to pay your bills and not borrow that money. Then you really don't want to borrow money for general operating expenses. That means just to pay the lights, pay the labor. That's money that has no real putback in the sense of value that's going to give you a return, because you have to have those things. And the real things that you would consider borrowing money for is strong assets, things like equipment, things like raw materials, things like the very base things that you've got to have that will, especially equipment, that you could borrow this piece of equipment or borrow money to purchase of a piece of equipment, and that takes you to the next level. See, you've already got a track record, you've already got a history, and now maybe a bank, maybe somebody that's legitimate. I'm going to talk about exorbitant interest rates in a minute, so you don't want to do that. But you could borrow some money and buy a piece of equipment. Or another thing that could happen, at least in the United States, is that we don't always get paid on the same day we do the work, or the same way to deliver the work. If you're at a restaurant, usually the person comes in, orders a meal, eats the meal, and then pays the cashier either as they're leaving or at the table. Well, in my business, it takes our customers the process of time, and I have agreed to sometimes 60 days for them to pay me, sometimes 45 days to pay. I don't want to go beyond that, but there's a legitimate time to go to the bank or borrow some money to say, hey, I've got this business, I've already in process, I need that time to get my bills paid, but get paid from my customers. That's called borrowing against your accounts receivable. That's probably an okay time to borrow. Well, what's a fair interest rate? I was in a particular country, I don't remember which one, and this individual was really strapped. They were in a tough spot. And they revealed the loans they had, and I said, well, what's the terms on the loans? And they said, well, one of them is 30% interest, and I've got to pay it back like in 30 days. That is a very, very, very poor loan. You're giving away all of your money just for interest. That's unfair usury is what the Bible would talk, in my opinion. And somebody's taken advantage of you to do that. And so you've got to be very careful that you don't find yourself in that kind of situation, that's your own option. Well, something fair would be the going rate of interest around a little higher, because you've got not the security that a bank has, but you know, when it got here more than 6, 8, 10% interest, that's pretty steep. That's just my opinion. Well, let's give some examples. Well, I started my moving and storage business. I'm sitting in a different business now, my machine shop. But way back in the very beginning, when I was starting my first business, I first of all did not have a loan from a bank for the first 7 years of my business career. And I kind of wish that I didn't borrow money at that time, but I had this concept that if I could just get bigger, things would be better. Well, that's not really normally the case. I needed to trim the fat. I needed to be more efficient. I needed to stay at the size I was, but I borrowed some money, and boy, was it hard to pay it back. I became servant to the lender. It was really, really hard to pay that back. And you know, you need to have some pretty good experience before you start borrowing money. We're just a beginner. That's what I talked about earlier in the investigation and the startup. You don't have the experience to do borrowing money because you just would be too loose with that money. You've got to have a handle on your accounting, a handle on your books, and so those are conditions that would allow you to borrow money. One thing that's an overriding factor, you need to look at your personal spending habits. And you need to be able to say, I have control on all of my spending. I don't buy things by impulse. Because there's many times I didn't buy something because there's no way I could. I had no money. Well, if you had some money and you don't have a real good handle on your spending habits, there it goes, out the window, and you'll spend it on things that are on the edge of foolish. It looks good at the time, but it's not what you need to be spending it. Well, there's a lot covered there. Borrowing money is risky, and paying it back is what creates the big push or the big problem when you borrow that money. I hope this helps you. I hope you understand we're here to help you inspiring better business. Thank you.